Thank you for listening to the Matt's Movie Reviews podcast, available on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Stitcher. Also, please follow Matt's Movie Reviews on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, Reddit, Instagram, and MeWe. And of course, be sure to visit mattsmoviereviews.net for the latest reviews, top 10 lists, and more. Now, on to the show.
Can we check for monsters?
Honey, there's no such thing as monsters. So what happened to me?
Honestly, we're not sure.
Can't find any other cases like mine in any of the medical journals.
Where did you get those bruises?
She comes into my room at night. She pinches me so I can't sleep. Two little ducks went out one day over the hills and far away. Mama duck said quack, 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 quack. But none of the little ducks came back.
Where's my daughter?
Hello and welcome to the Matt's Movie Reviews podcast. I am your host, Matthew Pejkovic, and this is episode number 458. Out now on Amazon and releasing September 16 on Google and Tubi is Surrogate, an Australian-made horror that stars Kestie Morassi as a single mother who must fight against an evil spirit that has targeted her family. A genuinely creepy ghost story that features terrific performances and a contender for scariest scene of the year. Surrogate is also the debut feature film of David Willen, who is joining me right now on the podcast. David, how are you today?
I am great, and thank you for having me on, Matt. Really appreciate it.
Not at all. It's so great to have you here. I was saying to you off air just how much I really loved Surrogate, and it's really interesting reading up about this film. This is something you co-wrote with Beth King. She's a screenwriter, has worked mostly in TV. She did like Nowhere Boys and Neighbours and a couple of other stuff as well. And from what I read or what I heard, you guys did like a brainstorming session like a few years back. You knew you wanted to do a horror film, just didn't know what at that moment. So you both sat down, had a bunch of ideas, and the one that really spoke to you was what Surrogate became. So what was it about the idea for Surrogate that really spoke to both of you, that you knew that this would be the film that would kind of be your, not only your debut feature, but of those 6-7 ideas was the right one for that time to go ahead with?
Yeah, I mean, some of those ideas just, we explored them and they just didn't have the potential for a feature film. So some were sort of dismissed or put to the side quite quickly, whereas there's about 3 or 4 that really had a potential for a full feature film. And Surrogate, I think it was just as we started to explore the ideas, it was very, rudimentary when we first came up with the initial idea. And the more we explored and delved into it, it was not only we saw the potential in the story, but we're quite excited about what the hook of the film was and how this ghost works within the context of the story and the main characters' lives. And as we fleshed it out and played around with it, we changed a lot of things from the initial screenplay draft. And it's just as that momentum built on it, we just saw the potential more and more for how well it could work.
I know that you've talked about influences. I'm not going to go too far down that road. I know you said like Exorcist and the others and a couple other films as well. I think, people can pick the movie apart and talk about the influences. What I think is a major influence from those films on your film, Surrogate, was that you put in the work in regards to the characters. One thing that I think people, Exorcist is one of my favorite films of all time. And the criticism that people have of it is that it's too slow at the start. And I'm like, that's ridiculous. You need to put the time in, the characters, in the setting. So when shit does hit the fan, you have stakes in the story. And I think that's something you did really, really well with what was happening in Surrogate as well. I mean, the character of Kestie, we find out about her, what her situation is the relationship with her daughter, and then things start to kind of like unravel and come apart. How important it was for both you and Beth to make sure that those stakes were in play, that the characters were built, and that the world building was there before anything kind of horrific or horror centric takes place.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So, The Exorcist is extraordinary. I mean, I don't find it boring at all. It's so well acted, directed, and written in that first third. And I think sometimes people mix up, character development with this current slow burn where nothing is actually happening. But
Right.
to me, so much is happening in The Exorcist. I mean, you've got a priest grappling with his faith and a mother trying to work out what's happening to her daughter that's getting progressively worse. So yeah, I was inspired, or we're inspired by just the quality of drama in that. And for us, it was really about the setting at the start was grounding the story. Horror films work best for the most part when they have a grounded setting and then the horror comes into it. So we sort of went, well, we need it's an everyday house. As I said to the production crew, Ben, the cinematographer, Bianca, our production designer, at the start, it's not a haunted house film. So we need to ground it in reality. And so there was that component to the grounding the setting in the reality. And then Beth and I always come, from a story, and particularly Beth from a character point of view. So we went, how do we develop these characters in a way that when the events start happening, we care about them, but it's also consistent with what's happening. A lot of horror films, and I don't mind that, but a lot of horror films will go, we just need a basic setup and put a few people in a situation so the horror and gore can happen to them. Whereas we really wanted that really solid story and the character development to progress through it. So yeah, we spent a lot of time focusing on those aspects.
So important is the casting of the lead role of Natalie and Kestie. Just a fantastic job there, because it's not only an emotional performance, it's not only things that are happening internally as well, but there's a physical aspect as well. You put her through the ringer in some scenes. There's one particular scene which features a lot of blood, but it's like the way that it's done. It's horrific, but it's also, there's a kind of like a very grounded kind of aspect in. I'm not going to say what it is, but it's something that maybe some women might watch and have some sort of find it relevant in some way, one way or another, especially in regards to what's happening with her. When it comes to Kestie dealing with those kind of scenes and the emotional turmoil that the character's gone through, what type of conversations do you have in regards to that? Do you have rehearsal process? Do you talk about backstory? How does it all kind of come together?
We spent, her performance is incredible in the film, not just from an emotional, but physically. I just realized how good an actress she is on expressing, not only just on her face, emoting emotion, but those physical requirements. She's really talented at that. And she worked very hard, very professional actress. And we spent a lot of time. So when she had the screenplay, we had a lot of Zoom meetings because she was based in Sydney at the time,
right,
just discussing the character and the story, and particularly that the key to her is that she's someone who's skeptical, and we have to chip away at that skepticism until she can't deny what's happening any longer. So part of it was just talking about the progression of what her character was doing, how that fitted into the story. From the emotional point of view, once we get into rehearsal, it's about the actors, first of all, just becoming comfortable with each other. And I knew that with Kestie and Tasha was playing Kestie's 9-year-old daughter in the film, the early rehearsal period was just about those two connecting. So we would just play games and nothing. We didn't talk about the script and rehearse scenes. We just play games and do little bits and pieces, because I knew once those two connected that they could emotionally trust each other. And then it's just about playing the scenes because the emotion's in the scene. And then we had a very good rehearsal period. And then when you get on set, it's really that process of, as you're shooting it, which bits to give direction, how you create the atmosphere when it needs to be an emotional scene. And with each actor, you're working out what makes them fire, what they require to get to where they need to be. And, part of that is with Kestie, with her big emotional scenes, and there's a lot of them, that she, music is how she was accessing emotion. So leading into that, I would be like, just give her a bit of alone time. She would go off somewhere and listen to her music and start to get that process happening. And the other part we also did a lot on set was just roll the camera and just say, when you're ready, go into that moment, and give her however long she needed to get those emotions boiling. and finally, when they're emotional, sometimes you can do the annoying direction that actors sometimes don't like, but you can say, okay, just one more, now go. Just one more go. Once you do that 4 or 5 times, they start to get very frustrated, but they're getting more worn down emotionally, take by take.
Do you usually find that when you're doing multiple takes, that usually the first and second is all you need, or do you find what you need usually later on with later takes?
It'll vary greatly. You know, sometimes you can get, there's a few sort of takes that we use in the film. Other times it might be, you know, the third or fourth take. A lot of times we didn't go into necessarily, you know, we weren't getting into 8, 9, 10, 11 takes on a lot of stuff. But yeah, it'll kind of vary. And sometimes it's just you run another take to try something different, or 90% of it's good, but you give a key piece of direction and play it again. But yeah, I was saying to someone, it would be an interesting exercise if a film was only the first take of every scene and every shot, because, you know, some of them, they're just understandably for, you know, that's why we have takes. Some of them a week off the bat. And sometimes they'll know that, you know, an actor will write and they go, can I do that again? You know, so they know they're not in it yet.
Something that's really interesting about Surrogate is that you have in the cast 3 9-year-olds, that 9-year-old girls are playing really prominent parts in it. And to me, when I was thinking on this morning, actually, it almost seemed like there was a trinity of the 3, and they all kind of play different roles that all to kind of interact with each other. So you have Tasha, who plays Kestie's daughter. She's the tormented. And then you have the ghost, who's the tormentor. And then you have the conduit between them both, which is Ali. She plays Ava, who's like kind of like this spirit medium kind of, which is really interesting in that she's like really young. Usually it's like an older person or something like that does that kind of thing. The 3 of them, kind of how they kind of work together, and it's kind of almost kind of symbiotic kind of relationship. That's really kind of interesting. Is that something that really came about organically? Is that something that you and Beth really worked on in the screenplay?
Yeah, it was going into casting, I suddenly had a moment when I'm like, oh my God, I need to find 3 7 to 10-year-old actresses that can pull off the roles, because they're all quite demanding for different reasons. And it was quite conscious in terms of comparisons of essentially children at the same age playing different functions. And we even for the Ava role did in auditions had some younger boys come through, because we really thought it was more about the age and the function they were playing. And I like that you said normally it's an older woman doing seance, because I actually said in the meeting, the first draft we didn't have it, and then we realized for a bunch of story reasons we needed that scene. And I said to Beth, it's like, it can't be an old gypsy woman with a Ouija board. So yeah, when we hit onto this idea that like, let's make it a young girl, it became a nice comparison to Tasha in the story, because they're very different characters and people at the same age. And then there's the classic, when you have 3 works really well in storytelling. So you have a third representation of a child. So yeah.
The Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is brought to you by TeePublic. TeePublic is the world's largest marketplace for independent creators to sell their work on the highest quality merchandise. With over 1.2 million designs, TeePublic is sure to have something you love. I think it's really interesting about your movies, because it's not the things that you do that is compared to other kind of films, is what you don't do to make it your film stand out from other movies. We talked about one of them, which is the old gypsy woman being the kind of the medium, what have you. The other thing that you don't do is that you don't have the Ouija board kind of scene kind of thing. What you have instead is this really interesting thing that I didn't know existed. So I watched your movie in this scene. It's kind of like a seance scene, I guess you might say. It features Ava sitting down with a mirror on either side of her, and she kind of evokes the spirit, and the mirror plays a role in its kind of. People, you all have to watch it to see it, because it's one of my favorite scenes in a horror film I've seen this year for sure. It's actually based on this kind of like this paranormal game called I think it's the Three Kings I got here. So for people who don't know, this became kind of like quite an online like YouTube kind of thing. I think like maybe 5-6 years ago, where YouTubers would sit down in a room. It has to be specifically at 3:30 in the morning for some reason. They had to have like some type of doll. They have to sit down to have the mirrors, and they try to conjure some type of spirits. Never knew this thing existed until I saw your movie. When was the first time you found out about the whole Three Kings kind of phenomena, and when did you know that this will make for a great movie scene, because it works really, really well?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a pretty special scene. Watching it with audiences in the cinema was great because you could just see them sort of sliding into their chairs and trying to hide. So yeah, it was really effective. And Beth actually discovered this. I didn't know this Three Kings ritual either. So Beth discovered it. We looked into it, and it's interesting because part of it, when you break down what they do, doesn't quite make sense.
Yeah.
What the point of that is. Like, I was looking at it, and we're still like, so what are you actually doing with this, or what's the outcome? But it was really fun, and there's these crazy viral videos on YouTube. So we just really used that as a point of inspiration, and it was about the mirrors. And then we essentially just took this idea of how we can build that a mirror can represent good or evil. And it was an interesting one in writing, because Beth and I, we bounce ideas off each other and we write scenes separately, then we script edit together. And that was one that Beth did the first pass of that scene, and it was short. It was only about 3 minutes or so. And normally in script writing, you want to be tightening things up, but I really saw the potential and said, let's expand this. So it turns into about 7 minutes, the scene. And I could really just see how you could build and play this element out, because the big question is will the ghost appear in the good or the evil mirror? And that was the one that everyone who read the script, who was getting involved in the project, that scene really stood out to them.
What really stands out in that scene as well to me is the color contrast. So the room is really kind of like darkish grey, and the whole tone is kind of darkish grey. And both both adult characters in the film are all wearing black, but the character of Ava's got this pink dress on, and it really kind of stands out. So when you're talking to your cinematographer, Ben Luck, who did work on a movie that came out last year, it was called Rage, which I thought was fantastic as well. When you're working with Ben and you think about the whole kind of color scheme of that, was the pink dress always something that was always in play? Because she's like, Ava's supposed to be like this symbol of light, or at least some type of vibrancy, as compared to like the ghostly figure who would is throughout the film, who's always like grey and such. I mean, it's an interesting color contrast between the background and what's in the dress that she's wearing.
Yeah, so I'm glad you're picking up on that. It was, and it comes back to this bit about how you deliver to an audience things they want to be seeing. You're watching a ghost horror, so there's elements you need to have in there, and it's also how can you do certain things a bit differently. And so when we decided that we're going to go with a child as playing more the medium character, the cliche would have been to have like a little gothic girl type character. And so I thought we'll play against type, and it actually was Ryan, who was our costume designer. When I met with him, I talked about that I don't want her to be that goth child, and he said, what if we go with a bright color in the scene? And so I said, yeah, I thought it was a really interesting idea, because also we don't know exactly what she's about and what she's up to initially. Yeah. So there's a mystery around her character, but it's also one of those moments that we made that decision, and then later that night I was just like, oh, this could really backfire. When you play against type, you don't know how it will go. And he designed and actually made that, tailored that dress for her. And when she, came on set with it, I was like, oh man, this looks great, because it does contrast these two colors, as you said, or the two color schemes in the scene. And costume ultimately was very important across the whole film. We spent a lot of time looking at all the costumes, and back on Kestie's performance, we spent a lot of time going through, as her character, shifting what's happening with her costume. And I'm glad to say that risk paid off, because I think, it looks incredible in the scene.
I want to talk about something that's really interesting. So we've talked about the influences, the specific films, whatever, Exorcist and the others, and I guess maybe throw a little bit of Rosemary's Baby in there as well. And the thing about your film and those ones, which I don't know if it's something you can answer, but the whole aspect of maternal figures in these horror movies. A lot of times, like in The Exorcist, there is no dad in the picture. It's kind of similar to your film as well. The Exorcist had like the two priests as the father figures, essentially. In the case of your movie, the closest thing to a father figure, I guess, is the uncle figure, the uncle in the movie. What do you think it is about maternal figures in these movies that stand out in such a way, especially when it comes to harm being done to a child, that the maternal figure always kind of stands out more than anything else. Because I think it's just a really kind of interesting dynamic that's in play throughout the whole film.
Yeah, and it's also what the film Beth and I both love is The Orphanage, the Spanish.
Yeah, it's a good one, yeah.
Beautiful piece of filmmaking. And that's interesting because that is the mother-father looking for a lost child and how that affects their relationship. And you're spot on. It's a very common character design that you have in these stories. And I think part of it just comes down to that vulnerability. You know, it's one thing when something's happening to you versus when it's happening to your child. And what was interesting, Beth and I don't have children. A lot of people thought that we did when they'd read the screenplay, and it was some writing colleagues and friends who read earlier drafts and gave feedback. You know, they were like, "Oh, gee, this is pretty rough. It made me think of my child, or if my child was in this situation." And I think it just hits a very core fear of, you know, vulnerability in children as well, and innocence, which Rose represents innocence in the story. And for Natalie, it's like, oh, is this, you know, am I somehow playing a part into this? So there's a guilt element for her character early in the story as well. Is she contributing to it? Is it her fault to some degree?
It's really interesting these days, the whole aspect of world building and, you know, sequels and spin-offs. And, you know, when I was watching your film, I thought that the character of Ava has really good potential to appear in maybe another film or have something based on the character on its own. Have you ever thought about taking that character and doing something more with it? Because I can foresee like the adventures of the, you know, supernatural adventures of Ava in the future, especially as she, you know, the actress herself, Ellie, kind of grows older. I think there'll be kind of a lot of interesting stuff you can do with that. Is there any type of idea kind of like branching that character out in any way?
Yeah, she's when we were shooting that on set, a few people, Ben the cinematographer is like, you know, she'd make a whole great film herself. And yeah, there's a lot of potential in it. And we, you know, when we're writing that whole storyline with her and her father and Natalie is, I think it's about, you know, it's 5 or 6 scenes, and they're all, you know, great to shoot and really fun to rehearse. And we did sort of see the potential in those characters. So yeah, maybe somewhere down the track we can kind of play around with that a bit more. But yeah, people are certainly gravitating towards her character.
I think what's so interesting, you know, is, as we spoke before, it's just so different, you know, and I think that's something I really appreciate watching Surrogate as well. And for everyone out there listening, Surrogate, you can see it now in the States on Amazon and releases September 16 on Google and Tubi. I really recommend people check out this film. Is it right that like earlier this year you actually had some theatrical screenings down in Victoria?
Yes. We ran at a few cinemas in Melbourne, and it did really well at what was a really tough period to be screening in cinemas. And it was Sun Theatre, which is in Yarraville in Western Melbourne. They ran. Well, it was actually really fun. We did a tech screening about 3 weeks before the film was finished, because the tough bit with a feature is if it's going to be for the big screen, all of your post production is on small screens in small rooms. So we the Chrissa Jansen, who's the marketing manager at Sun Theatre, who I know, sort of offered that we could do a tech screening. So about 15 of us, so it was mainly the producers, heads of department, and a couple of other people. We went into the cinema at midnight to watch the film, which was really fun. And Chris really liked it. So she, you know, we programmed a world premiere there. And that sold out really quickly. We actually outsold Batman at that cinema that week.
Nice.
The Batman, which was really cool. And we also outsold Morbius, but I found out after the fact that wasn't much of an achievement. But their marketing budget was bigger than ours. So then they put it on for a second screening, and then they just rolled it on for a couple of weeks because it kept selling really well. And it was great meeting, you know, lots of different horror fans and different people who come along to see it, and just seeing their reactions. It was really fun.
Well, I saw it at home on my screen, and I absolutely loved it. It works well, both big screen and small, from all indications. And for everyone out there listening, please do check out this movie. Put it on late at night. Grab yourself a popcorn. watch the film. Do it by candlelight if you want to. If you want to be even more risky, get a couple mirrors as well. Watch this movie, Surrogate. It's really terrific film. I'm a big advocate for Aussie horror, and I think what you did here, David, is a really, really great stuff. Thank you so much for your time today. And best of luck with the release, man. I hope it goes really well for you. Early reviews have been very positive. I'm sure that's going to go on. I'm sure you're going to get even more reviews as the release ramps up. So best of luck to you, and thank you again for your conversation.
Thank you for your kind words, and thanks for having me on. It's been great.
Thank you for watching the Matt's Movie Reviews channel. Please subscribe for more reviews, podcast interviews, and exclusive content. Also, if you would like to request a review and support my work, please join my Patreon via the link in the description below.